In this exercise, we want the integral of 2 times absolute value of cosine of x from 0 to 3 pi over 2. This absolute value is really hard to deal with. So what we're going to do is we're going to see where cosine of x is positive and negative, and then evaluate the integrals separately. So the first step is to set cosine of x to 0 and solve it. What we know is that cosine of x is 0 between 0 and 3 pi over 2 only for x equals pi over 2. Because cosine of x is 0 at pi over 2, and then 3 pi over 2, and then 5 pi over 2, and so forth, or at minus pi over 2 also, if you remember your unit circle. But this one is just at the boundary point, so we don't, what we need is the zeros between 0 and 3 pi over 2. So what we'll do is, from 0 there is a pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2. So we'll integrate the cosine of x from 0 to pi over 2, and then we integrate from pi over 2 to 3 pi over 2. One of them will be negative because cosine is negative in this region, so that will be negative, and then we'll erase that minus sign and add them up. Okay, so integrate from 0 to pi over 2 of 2 cosine of x. This will give us 2 sine of x evaluated from 0 to pi over 2. So that's 2 sine of pi over 2. Let me see if I can remove that. No, that's not what I want to do. I want to remove this. I want to remove this. Okay. All right. That won't work. Okay. So that's sine of so that's 2 sine of pi over 2 minus 2 sine of 0. Sine of 0 is 0, so ignore that. Sine of pi over 2 is 1, so that gives you 2 times 1. Save that. Next, integrate from pi over 2 to 3 pi over 2 of 2 cosine of x dx. This gives you 2 sine of x. Evaluate that from pi over 2 to 3 pi over 2. That gives you 2 times sine of 3 pi over 2 minus 2 times sine of pi over 2. If you remember your trig values, sine of 3 pi over 2 is minus 1. And sine of pi over 2 is 1. So that gives you minus 2 minus 2. And that gives you minus 4. So the integral from pi over 2 to 3 pi over 2 is of 2 cosine of x is minus 4. So if I had an absolute value, that would eliminate the minus, because cosine of x we know has only one sign. From pi over 2 to 3 pi over 2 it's only negative, because we set it to 0 and we solved it and we got pi over 2. So there's no 0 between pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2. So the integral from 0 to 3 pi over 2 of 2 cosine of x dx is 2 plus absolute value of minus 4. So just simply 4. This gives us 6, and that's the final answer.